Hi everyone, it's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. Did you know that it costs me money to produce each episode of this podcast? I really appreciate your help to keep my show on the air and helping other people. Please join me over on Patreon, where you can also find commercial-free episodes, and the links are in the show notes. Thanks so much. Hi everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. I do have a content warning before we get started today. We will be discussing child marriage and forced marriage today and all that goes along with it. So if you need to excuse yourself from this interview, then I sure hope you'll join us again for the next one. My guest today is Sara Tasneem, who recently participated on our child marriage panel at the Conference on Religious Trauma. Sara is a survivor of forced child marriage who advocates publicly to end child marriage in the United States. Her story has been featured in the documentary Not a Forced Marriage Story and has been shared across national and international multimedia outlets. Sara works alongside nonprofit organizations and other survivor advocates to raise awareness and to lobby and testify for legislation that seeks to end child and forced marriage. She volunteers as a peer mentor to girls and women who have experienced child marriage and forced marriage. She sits on multiple coalitions, including the California Coalition to End Child Marriage and the National Coalition to End Child Marriage. Sara has a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in business administration from Golden Gate University and currently works as a finance analyst. Wow, you are so busy doing all those different things. Welcome to the show. It's nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It seems like we actually were just talking. It was only a few weeks ago that we were together online for the Conference on Religious Trauma, and you participated in that excellent child marriage and forced marriage panel. That was one of the highlights, I think, of the conference this year. So thanks for participating.
Yeah, it was a wonderful event and also just so relevant to talk about, child marriage within strict religious contexts.
Yes, I know that I was very shocked. Probably it was only within the last year that I found out in the United States that in most of the states, it's still legal for parents to marry off their underage children. I mean, we're not typically talking 6 and 7 years old, but we're talking 14 years old, too young to be able to make a decision, a commitment for the rest of their life. And it can be within religious groups and it can be within cultural groups, but I certainly found it shocking.
Yes, it's extremely shocking that it's still allowed to this day in 40 states in our country, and that has been after quite a bit of fighting to advocate to change the laws in the 10 states that have passed laws to end child marriage. And so what that basically means is that when we ask for a state to end child marriage, we're asking them to end marriage under the age of 18 without exception, because currently there are exceptions written into the laws in 40 states. And when I started advocating, it was all 50. So,
wow. So that shows us that your advocacy work and others who are working with you to end child marriage, you are making progress. It's just painstaking and painfully slow. It's hard for me to understand why it's considered acceptable in 2023 in the United States of America for underage people to be married off by their parents. It's not just child brides, it's sometimes child grooms as well.
Yeah, that's correct. And I generally work with organizations who are bringing legislation forward and sharing my story. However, it takes so many folks on the ground and legislators and coalitions within states and just a lot of groundwork to be able to pass some of these laws. And so I'm kind of just one advocate, and I try to show up where I can. But again, I do have, my daytime job, which takes up most of my time. But I do try and show up for this issue because it's so important to me that minors are not being forced into marriages under the age of 18, because of many things, but firstly, that they are legally minors. So in order for them to exit from that marriage, it's extreme barriers that they face to be able to exit that marriage. And so it actually creates a legal trap for minors who marry under the age of 18 because they cannot hire an attorney if they want a divorce. They can't enter into a shelter of their own accord without a guardian signing off. They can't enter into a lease agreement if they want to exit their marriage and find other housing. So there's just, and also, I mean, the family law system is really not designed for a minor to navigate it with children. So if you can imagine being a minor forced into a marriage at 14, trying to leave then at maybe 16, and maybe having a child with you, how do you navigate the legal processes and everything else as a minor? The system is just simply not designed for that. And so that's why I try to give a voice for all those folks who are still being forced into marriages to this day.
Yes, and thinking that it's typically the parents that are forcing the marriage in the first place, so that your immediate people that you would go to for help when you're under, in a terrible situation, they are not going to be any help. And if the only community you've really known is their religious or cultural community, which thinks it's A-okay, doesn't have any problem with child marriage or forced marriage, you really are in a bind, in a serious pickle. So I'm so grateful that you're doing the work that you do. I would never even have thought of those things that you just mentioned right now. But yeah, if you're under 18, you don't have a credit card, probably. You're not going to be able to secure a loan of any sort. You can't really sign your name on a lease or legal binding contracts. And then what does that mean if you have this child that's your child, but the other person has all the power? I mean, I imagine that's how a lot of young mothers especially get trapped and must stay, they feel, in that marriage because the husband has all the authority and all the power.
That's absolutely correct. Most women and even, young boys, it really is about the power differential. And that is what creates the situation of domestic abuse that exists within the relationship. So a lot of people think that domestic violence is actual physical violence. But what it really is a power differential within the relationship. And so going into a relationship, if you are a child in a relationship with an adult, there's already a serious imbalance of power that exists. And on top of that, children who marry are 3 times more likely to be exposed to physical violence within their relationship, sexual violence, and you name it, all kinds of other abuses, which is why child marriage has been named as a human rights abuse. And the United Nations is committed to ending child marriage internationally as part of their goals. So it's not just here in the United States. Obviously, it's international. It happens internationally. But I think in the United States, we have the added burden of explaining to the public that it actually happens here, which is not something I think that people have to do in other countries such as India or Africa, like parts of Africa, or different countries where people kind of assume that child marriage is happening, but it also happens here in the United States and many all over the world. Really, it happens all over the world.
What's the benefit? I mean, I don't understand why politicians, when they are asked that question and said, please help us end child marriage in the United States, why they're saying, oh, no, no, we can't possibly do that. I don't want to put my name on that. What is going on there?
Well, if you're asking me, from my own personal opinion, it is the patriarchal structures in which we live in, and in which these laws were originally created. So the marriage laws that we have on the books, harken back to common law, which treated women as property of their father and then of their husband. So the laws are rooted in that structure, and they haven't really changed much. They have changed a bit throughout the decades, but it also kind of boils down to our society's view of women in relation to childbirth. And our society has determined that if you are able to bear a child, you should also be able to get married. However, as we kind of go through time and evolve, you would think that maybe our laws would kind of catch up to that,
Mhm.
and not require and allow us to determine our own fates.
Wow. I mean, I would have been physically able to conceive a child when I was 10 years old then. Uh, but I certainly, under no circumstances, would have been prepared to be a wife or
Yeah.
raise a child. I was still a child, and in some ways, it feels like a betrayal of the body to be able to launch a child into so-called womanhood that early. It's just very it's frustrating, and then to know that our laws have not they're not adequately recognizing that a child is a child and deserves to be a child and enjoy a childhood. And I see that too, certainly looking at now the restrictions that have been placed on women's and girls' reproductive rights. Very scary. It's a scary time in the United States right now as we see important, significant rights being peeled back. So that is,
Yeah.
I do understand that that's a scary time. I wanted to ask if you would walk us through a little bit of your own circumstance, how you came to be married off as a young teen.
Yeah, definitely. So just to give a little bit of context, my parents divorced when I was about 5 years old, and my dad, prior to that, since like probably when I was still a baby, joined a Sufi cult. And him and my mom actually joined, but then when I was around 5, my mom decided to leave. And because my dad was a part of this very strict cult, he actually kept me and my brothers. And our contact with our mom kind of fell off. Like he really kind of kept us away from our mom in our early childhoods. And
And this was in the United States, Sarah?
yes, I was born in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
And then when I was 10, we moved to California. And during my early youth, my dad was not always abusive, but he became more and more abusive as he got, I think, more involved with the group, and also remarried a few times. And so he became extremely abusive, and I think the cult kind of allowed for that abuse to kind of go unnoticed as well. I think as with many cult survivors, children are the most vulnerable population in those groups, and often the most exploited. And that was very much the case for myself. I grew up with really strict gender norms. Um, when I was living with my father, I mean, we were told things that, very we had a very strict lifestyle as girls within that group. So, covering our hair and the sexes were separated in any type of community events. We weren't really allowed to talk to men other than our own siblings. And it was just a very insular community. And then when I turned 12, I was sent to live in Colorado from California. And I was kind of reunited with my mom, and was able to live with her for a few years until I was 15. And I was actually able to, have somewhat of a normal childhood when I was with her. I was going to school. I had friends. And in my freshman year of high school, I had a boyfriend, and I would go to his basketball games after school, and, he would come over to my school, and it was, it was nothing serious. It was a 15-year-old thing.
Yeah.
But, for my family, it was very serious, and it was crossing the line of, of what was right and what was wrong. For my mom, she had left the group, and she was not involved with them, and she was very kind of free with her own life. So I don't think it was as much of an issue for her. But she told my dad that I did have a boyfriend, and I think when she told him that, he started planning for me to get married. And so that's kind of the context of what before I went to visit my dad. So I was living in Colorado with my mom. I was finishing my freshman year of high school, and my thought was that I really wanted to go to law school. So I was going to join the Air Force potentially, and then try to get into law school at some point. And that was kind of what I was envisioning my life to be as a 15-year-old. And my dad asked that my brothers and I go visit him in California that summer. And so we did, and I hadn't seen my dad for a few years, and I was really not looking forward to seeing him because, again, like, he was super abusive to me and my brothers when we were young. And as soon as I got off the airplane, he basically sat me down and said, "You are not allowed to have sex outside of marriage. You are going to damn me to hell and the whole family. And, this just can't happen." And so the leader of his group was going to pick my husband. And
Oh
at the
my gosh.
time, yeah, at the time when he told me that, I really didn't have much of a reaction because I didn't know exactly what he was talking about.
And it's pretty shocking.
Right. I didn't, because there were other girls in the group, but I had been gone for a while. I had been gone for a couple of years, so I was out of touch. And I knew that my stepsisters had been married, but I didn't know, like, the context around it. And so I didn't really know what he meant. I thought maybe it was an engagement, or I had no idea. And then he had been planning a religious conference with himself and the group. They were planning a huge conference to take place in Los Angeles. And so we traveled there that summer by car, like, we all caravan down there. And it was during the conference that I was introduced to a man who was 28 years old. And my dad told me to go over and talk to him. He was sitting in a coffee shop, and I just saw that he was a man. He was 28 years old, and again, I was 15. And I sat across from him, and he just said, "Well, I don't want to wait for a long engagement." And it was a very short conversation in which I really didn't talk that much because I was told, like, not to look at men in the eyes. And in this context, I was with the group with my dad. So, I was very much following their rules. And so after that conversation, I was told that I would be married to him that night. And my dad's family was there, and they helped get me ready for the wedding. Somebody
Your,
gave
your
me,
dad's family was also part of the cult.
some of them were, and some of them weren't.
Mm.
But I think the overall thinking for them was that this was my dad's responsibility. And I know that many of them didn't approve of it, but they didn't really step up and say, hey, let's call your mom, or let's do something. How are you feeling about this kind of a thing? And I think even if they had asked me that, I probably would have said, well, I don't know. I mean, it was happening so fast that I had no time to understand really what was happening. And I was 15. So like, my dad is telling me I have to do something. I'm going to comply with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also, I don't know if I was scared, but I definitely was always fearful of my dad, but I also wanted his approval. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that was a big part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but basically, I was, after a ceremony that evening performed by the leader of the group, which was, a big deal for my dad. I was handed over to this perfect stranger who I had just met that morning over a very short conversation, and I was physically handed over to him, and my entire childhood ended that night. I would never ever be the same person. I never got to go back to my life. I never got to go back to my mom. I was taken out of the country a week later. All of this without my mother's knowledge.
Oh
She
my.
was told that I was going to stay with my father. I was not going to come back to live with her, which was devastating to her.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she didn't know that I was being taken out of the country and forced into a marriage. So I was taken out of the country, and I became immediately pregnant. And um, after about 6 months, we returned back to the Bay Area where the group was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we were actually living in the leader's house for a while. We were living in his basement.
You and your husband and your
My
child.
Well, she wasn't born yet.
Oh, I
So
see.
I was 6 months pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
and I was living in a situation which um, can only be described as being kidnapped and raped on a daily basis.
Oh
But
dear.
in my own mind, I didn't think of it as that, because
Mm-hmm.
I thought, I was following the rules. I was being
Right.
a good daughter. I was being a good wife. I was being a good follower.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so 6 months after we came back to the United States, where in California, the statutory age for consent is actually 18 years old. And so at that time, he was committing statutory rape,
Mm-hmm.
among other things. Um, so he was advised to marry me legally. And because the group that my dad was a part of, encouraged underage marriage, and they knew how to do it. They knew how to use the laws in their
Mm-hmm.
favor.
Mm-hmm.
So they advised him to go to Reno, where at that time, it only took a permission slip from my father to consent to the marriage. I was never asked, is
Wow.
this something that I want? My mother was never informed. We were married in a drive-through wedding chapel, only a short 4-hour trip from where we were living at the time. And I had nobody there for me that was representing my interest. And I was still a
Wow.
child. I was 16. There was clear evidence of a rape, which was my pregnant belly.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody alerted the authorities. And even if they did, there wouldn't have been anything they could do, because at the time, and still, well, actually, the laws in Nevada have changed, because I actually went and um, testified there twice. But at the time, it was perfectly legal what was happening. And in California, it still is legal. In California, there's no age floor to be married. So actually, in today's world, it would have been easier for them to marry me in California versus
Wow.
Nevada.
So even though they have a statutory rape that if you're under 18, someone older than that is not to be having sex with you. They're committing rape if that's the case. But you can be married off at
At
14.
zero. At
And then
zero. Yeah. In
and
California, the age floor is zero.
wow.
Yeah.
There's just no excuse for that. Okay. Wow. Trying to wrap my mind around that. Okay. So you went to Nevada and then you were legally married at that point. And
Right.
what's so you're getting used to your day-to-day life. You've gone from being a freshman in high school to, I imagine, being responsible for all the cooking and cleaning and whatever else for this man who was a stranger to you.
Yeah. Well, actually, at the time I was living in the leader's house, so I was cooking and cleaning for their family every day until I was almost giving birth. And then
Wow.
after I gave birth, they moved us to another house where there were multiple followers living there. So I had zero control over anything that was going on in my life. The only thing that I knew was that I needed to protect my the baby inside of me, and I was trying to do that to the best of my ability.
Mhm.
But I think emotionally, I just wasn't feeling anything. I think there was just a part of me that had turned off, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. And so, yeah, I don't know that I knew what was going on until much later on.
Mhm.
That what was happening was extremely wrong. And
Well, were you seeing a doctor? I mean, was there
when I went to
somebody?
see anytime I was going to see a doctor or um, any type of medical care, I would be accompanied either by, people in the group or my husband, but somebody was always with me. And, um, I was told that, well, you can't trust them because they're going to look down on you and here's what you should say. So I was coached and
Mhm.
I was very compliant because I mean, what am I gonna do? I was a 15-year-old with
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
pregnant, so there's not much that
Wow.
I could do, except for, really try to accept the situation and
Yes.
try to be as happy as I could because
Mm.
I think that's kind of what helped me survive was to just find even though the situation was horrific, I was able to find my own, like, way to kind of, um, I guess not be maybe happy is not the word, but, like, Um, okay, I guess.
Mhm. You were surviving.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, so the after that legal marriage happened, what that allowed for him and my other abusers, because it's not just my ex that was the abuser. It was the entire group because they were the ones telling me that this was supposed to happen and creating that environment where not just me was married, but many of my friends and my sisters and so many girls my age were all married off very young, and they were told that this was their path to being a good follower and believing um, and that was just what we were supposed to do. We weren't allowed to use birth control. We weren't um, you know, we were supposed to listen to our husbands no matter what. We were supposed to have sex with them whenever they asked for it. Um,
Mhm.
you know, we were not to question things.
Right.
Um, so the legal marriage allowed him to get away with statutory rape, kidnapping, and in my opinion, a lot of other things that he should have been accountable for, and the group should
Mhm.
have been accountable for.
Mhm. And did he work? Did he have a job? How did the cult keep going?
So, my ex, like many other of the followers, they tended to come from, well, I would say the recruited followers, not the ones that were born into it, but the recruited followers either came from families where there was wealth or there was there was something that they could give to the leader of the group. And so he did come from a wealthier family and but he wanted to stay in the United States. So that was another positive for him was that he was able to apply for citizenship through my because I was born here in the United States. And so he was able to work here. He bounced around from job to job. He was not great at holding a job. But yeah, we eventually moved to our an apartment where I think it was around when my daughter was like maybe a year and a half or so. She was kind of toddling around, and I would take her to the park in the morning. And I saw kids around my age walking to school, and I thought to myself, wow, I really want to go back to school. That I really want to do that. And that
Mm-hmm.
was since my ex abuser was going to work during the day, I could call places, and we had that was kind of we had the dial-up internet, so I could go and start doing searches on things. So I started calling places because I didn't really know, but I was curious about what was happening in the outside world. And I started calling places, and I said, would you be interested in hiring me? And usually people would just hang up on me. And then once I got this guy on the phone, and he was like, well, what are your qualifications? And I said, well, I don't have any. He said, well, maybe you should start by getting your education. And so I said, okay. So I thought about it, and then I started doing research, and I found out that there was an adult school close by, and I could get my GED, and then I could start going back to school. So I had to ask my husband because, obviously he controlled everything in my life, including the finances. And so I had to ask him, even if I wanted to go to the grocery store, if I wanted to go anywhere, I had to ask him because I couldn't drive. So I couldn't get around anywhere. And so I asked him if I could go back to school, and he said, well, you have to ask the group. So you have to go ask the leader. So then I was told that I shouldn't ask the leader, I should ask his wife. So I went to ask his wife, and every time you see or greet the leader, you have to kiss their hand and, pay your respects to them. And so that was kind of, the opening of the conversation. I said, and I kind of laid out my case. I said, I really want to go back to school. I think it would help my family because, we're struggling financially. And she said, are you crazy? Like you're a mother, you're a wife. You should be at home with your daughter, taking care of her. Why do you even want to go back to school? That's for the men, and you're going to make him feel like he's less of a man if you do that.
Wow.
And I think a part of me was just like, no, I want to do this. And that was a turning point for me that I will always remember, because I was just like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to listen to her, and I'm going to do what I want. And I think the people in the room saw that, and she saw that, and that was kind of when they started treating me differently. So
How so?
I would say that was like kind of the beginning of the end for me, where they started kind of shunning me because I had brought up the fact that I wanted to go to school. And so when they start to shun people, they start talking about them, gossiping about them, making things up, and just generally being rude and hateful and saying things about the person, and I guess kind of setting it up for to later on label, because anytime a woman would leave the group, they would say that, oh, she's crazy. And so I think that was always the narrative. Well, she's crazy, she just left. And so I think that's what they were setting up. But I started going back to school. I figured it out. I started taking public transportation. And really, for me, I think education was my pathway to my freedom, because it helped me learn how to navigate the outside world, which is what I was being held back from.
Right. But what, practically speaking, So did you just tell your husband then, well, I'm just going back to school and you'll just have to deal with it? And what did you do with your little one then when you were attending classes?
Yeah, those are very practical questions and huge barriers that I had to figure out. If, again, I had to ask my husband for everything. So
Mhm.
anytime I would leave the house, um, I would have to tell him where I was. I would have to explain my entire day to him, show receipts for anything that I bought. It was a very controlling relationship.
Mhm.
And my daughter, luckily, my sister in law at the time was running a daycare and she agreed to watch her while I was going to school.
Was she living on the compound or near you guys?
No, she was a part of the group, but she, um, I guess at the time was a little bit less involved. And she loved my daughter. And so I felt comfortable like having her stay there and while I was going to school. And so so once I kind of figured out those pieces, there wasn't much that he could do besides like question everything that I was doing when I came home and use it to start arguments and get angry. And so, yeah, it wasn't easy in any type of way. I mean, it was very challenging. I was having to navigate a relationship where I had no power and he wanted to keep it that way. And so any chance he could get, he would try and find ways to put me down and try and keep me in that relationship. And
Right.
so that really kind of took a toll on my self-esteem, but I think it also made me want to fight back. But I knew I couldn't leave right away because I would have been homeless. And I didn't want to do that and not be able to provide for my daughter. And so I started going back to school, and then um, I found out I was pregnant again. And in most marriages, that's a great thing, but in my marriage, it was not. It was,
Mm.
and I say this, but I love my children, and um, I'm so grateful that they're in my life because they're the reasons why I fought for freedom.
Mm.
But it was devastating for me to find out that I was pregnant for a second time.
Mhm.
And that was when I reached out to my mom. And
Hey.
so things kind of took a turn
Yeah.
once I
Wow.
reached out to my mom. Yeah.
And what did she say?
Well, she was just really grateful that she had heard from me at all, because during
Yeah.
this whole time she found out that I had been married, but then we had no contact. I had no contact with her.
Right.
And so she just wanted to be a part of my life and knew that I was in this cult and I was brainwashed and I was in a horrible situation. So I think she just wanted to open the door of communication, which she did. And helped me started questioning things in my life that I couldn't see for myself.
Mm.
And I think a big part of me being able to leave was her encouragement to continue to go back to school, and that she would be there for me if I needed her, but not, she didn't say, you have to leave now. I think when you tell a survivor something like that, it feels so intense, and, you know, it could really end up jeopardizing their safety.
Okay.
Because a lot of people who are in domestic violence situations, the most dangerous time for them is the time when they're trying to leave.
Mhm.
And so I had to figure out a plan for myself,
Right.
which took me a really long time. It took me 7 years to separate. And I finally did after I got my first paycheck. I had gone to culinary school and started working as a chef. And my first paycheck, I told my ex that I no longer wanted to be married to him. And it was, again, it was like it, it feels like that was the beginning of another hard time, but it was me fighting for my freedom now. And
Mhm.
so it was worth it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you were still living together at that time when you said, I'm
Yeah.
done with this. And then was it like, I'm done and I'm taking the kids? Or then, I mean, so you were an adult by that time because it was 7 years later?
I was 23 at the time, and he told me that he was going to take the kids for the summer to his parents' house, which was out of the country, and that, once I had a place and everything, he would bring them back. Well, of
Mm,
course, that didn't happen. He tried to keep the children. I had to fight for them, and I couldn't afford a lawyer. So it was basically me negotiating with him and his parents. And, um, it took me 3 years to get a divorce. And during that time, he actually came back to the United States and assaulted me. Um,
oh my
and
gosh.
it, it was extremely difficult to get a divorce even as an adult. Now
Wow.
imagine navigating that as a child. There's
Really?
just no, it is absolutely impossible.
Wow.
It's almost impossible as an adult, but let alone being a child. And of course, I was working now as a chef, so I had to figure out childcare for my kids, and on top of it, figure out how I was going to get this divorce. And my mom helped support me, I guess, emotionally, and at times financially, and at times she helped with childcare and things like that. But there was only so much she could do. My mom was struggling with her own health issues. And so I really did have to figure it out on my own for the most part. And luckily, so there were other women in the cult who had left. So I was able to connect with them too. And I think I just want to say that having a community once you leave a situation like that is so important. Having a
Mhm.
support network is so important because it's so hard to do it, and it's almost impossible to do it alone.
Yes, yes, exactly. I'm so glad that there were other women who had left the community that you could turn to, that you could talk to, who had already done some of this work on their own before you, so they could have a bit of a blueprint for you. Wow, I just can't even imagine. There must have been times where you felt so devastated, like when your husband didn't bring the children back, or then
Yeah.
he did come back and he assaulted you. That is just so unacceptable and so despicable. Um, and then you're just doing everything you can think of to try and survive, keep body and soul together, also take care of your children while you're working. Those demands are just incredible. And that's before you were even starting to address any of the trauma from the brainwashing, from being in the cult, from being assaulted repeatedly from the time you were in your early teens.
Yeah. It's the process of recovery. And I think many survivors know this is just not a very linear process.
Hmm.
And it often happens when you're in a space where you're safe. So it makes absolutely no sense to you why all of a sudden things are coming up for you because you're in a safe space. And
Hmm.
that's actually why. That's why
Yeah.
they come up, is because you have the ability to process the trauma. Um, but most of my early adulthood, and well, frankly, my entire childhood, was surviving.
Hmm.
So I didn't really know what anything outside of that looked like. And
Right.
it wasn't really until I met my husband in 2010, and I kind of discovered what a good relationship looked like. But
Wow.
up until then, I really just didn't have the best relationships because I never knew what that looked like. I didn't ever have an example of what that looked like. Um, and and I think having all the trauma, it doesn't allow you to find who you really are. Um,
Exactly.
and so that it makes it hard to find a partner. as well. That's
Yeah.
healthy.
Yeah. It's so true. I mean, because you didn't have the options that are typically available to people in their teens as they're deciding, do I like this or do I not like this? Will I try this? Will I reject this? Whether you go through a goth phase or whatever kind of those options were off the table for you because you were bang, you're a wife, now you're a mother. This is what you get to do. You have no rights. You're the property of this person who had been a stranger to you. So then once you're able to leave that situation, first of all, you're so busy focusing, just trying to stay afloat. You don't really have time and the energy to be thinking about, well, who am I? And what do I really like and dislike? Because you got so many plates in the air that you're trying to keep up. So then you met your new husband in 2010, did you say?
Yeah, 2010. So I think my recovery process didn't really start until I was in my late 30s. And I think that's true for many survivors. Like it kind of takes a safe space and then somebody who can help reflect on things. But for me, it was that I was dealing with symptoms of PTSD, probably since I had left the cult, but they had gotten worse, and that created a lot of anxiety and tension within my relationship. So I sought out therapy, and my mom passed away in 2014. So then I
Mhm.
really kind of focused on, okay, this is deeper than just grief, and I started really doing therapy regularly. And I think that's really, for me, that's what helped me turn a corner. Of course, there were steps along the way, like becoming financially stable, and, continuing my education and that kind of thing where, that helped build my survival and the ability to be able to support having therapy in my life.
Mhm. Mhm.
But for many people, that's just not even an option because they're still struggling to survive and meet their basic needs.
Yeah. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I think therapy was a huge part of, and still is a huge part of my recovery. But again, it's like, it's never, I don't think you ever recover from that type of childhood trauma. I think it's just an ongoing thing, and
Mhm.
it can be pretty circular, but you get better slowly. I
Right.
guess
Mhm.
you're able to understand what healthy relationships look like slowly, and
Yes.
then you can make changes in your life around that.
Well, how about your children? So eventually the divorce did happen.
Hmm.
I don't know if you had full custody, if you shared custody. The kids are grown now, but
Hmm.
what was that part like?
Well, my kids did end up coming back to live with me after, I fought for them to come back, and um, they stayed with me for most of their childhood. There was a point in my life where I lost my job as a chef, and I got hurt on the job. And so
Oh,
I wanted to go back to school. And my mom offered to take the children while I was back in school. So she actually took the kids for 2 years, and they lived with her in Colorado, up in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains.
wow.
And yeah, so they lived with her for 2 years while I went back to school, and then they came back once I was back on my feet, and they've been with me ever since. And they they do have a relationship with their father, but I have always kind of let them choose how they wish to engage, just because I think no matter what happened, they should decide what what that relationship is for them. I don't
Mhm.
want to decide that for them.
Right. They
Because
have
just
their autonomy there.
exactly. And since I had all of my autonomy taken away at such an early age, I just really believe in letting them decide their whatever it is that they want to do in their lives, which they have. And they're both, my daughter is 26 and my son is 23, and they're both very much in charge of their own lives and fates. And yeah, they are the reason for everything in my life. I think I've always wanted to give them a better life and just a better chance, you know.
Wow. And so you have. How amazing. How incredible. Your story is heartbreaking and anger inducing. I feel so upset when I think of you in that situation and other children and teens forced into a situation that feels so hopeless and so desperate. And you have done the work. You've gone through it all, and now you're advocating to help. You're trying to make the world better for these people, for kids now and in the future. And that is just so inspiring. I just am so grateful. I feel honored to be able to have this talk with you, and thank you for sharing your story. And I don't know if you have any words of advice for anyone who might be listening, who kind of is in a similar situation, or even if, should someone say something if they think something is going on? Should they ask the young person if they need help? Or
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for for bringing this topic to your audience. It's really important that we continue to have this dialogue about child marriage, just because it's such an underreported issue. And if my advice to any young person who is possibly going through this is that there is help out there. You're not alone. Um, I think one of the hardest things for me was feeling that feeling of isolation and abandonment. And if anybody is going through that, just know that you are not alone. There are organizations out there that can help. Unchained at Last, Tahare Justice Center, um, even the National Domestic Violence Hotline is an avenue to get resources in your own area. And of course, they're welcome to reach out to me. I will leave my email with Janice in the show notes. And for anybody who is in a situation where they think this is happening to somebody, I would definitely reach out to them and make sure that they know that they're safe. They're a safe person to talk to if they feel like they need to talk to them, and be that safe person for the child who may not have it anywhere else.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just that really feels like the least that we can do as humans on this planet, just caring for other humans, and particularly ones who are so vulnerable as children and teens. So thank you again, Sara, for sharing your incredible, amazing story with us. And I know that it can be taxing and challenging and stir things up when we share these stories. So, of course, I trust you have your own tools in your toolbox, that you'll take excellent care of yourself this evening. And we will include your email and also some of the contact information for those excellent organizations that you named. So thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you. I appreciated being on your show. Thank you so much.
I hope our paths cross again soon. Thank you, Sara. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in this week. And we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.